So, infant development is such a vital part of who we are because it echoes on through life. And that's why they talk about the first 1,000 days. It's from conception to more or less a baby's second birthday. That period is fundamental in the way we are shaped. We are shaped by our genetic donors, which are normally the parents. We are shaped by conditions in utero. We are shaped by the birth process, quite strongly so. And we are shaped by the first 2 years in life. We're shaped continuously. But that is such a fundamental time frame. Because if you look in your manual and you look at there's just 3 examples of 3 different graphs, but the graphs just give one a little bit of an idea of the importance of those first 1,000 days. Because what makes it so remarkable is that, and don't get confused when you look at it. You may read about executive function, decision making. It's not the skill per se. It's the hardware that you need to be able to develop the skill and the competencies later on. But it's the time frame when the brain and all its little bits, remember the brain is just the central nervous system. It cannot function without the support of the peripheral nervous system, sensory input and motor output. And for that reason, nature is phenomenal. It doesn't rely on the parents only, because what if one has illiterate parents, or what if one has literate parents, but they're not particularly interested about infant development? Where does that leave you? What if the family is very poor and there's a hiccup with nutrition or things like that? The thing with nature, it doesn't leave things for fluke. So where you grew up does not have to be a disadvantage. I mean, if we see rural children in South Africa, and we see how little they have in terms of bought toys, but how rich the environment is in terms of natural resources. And the distances they walk to school, we often think it's terrible. It's actually a gift, because it reaffirms and it stimulates and it develops the innate wiring. So the first 1,000 days is vitally important, because in that time frame, nature does not leave margin for error. Errors occur. But nature endowed every single baby with a series of primitive reflexes. Well, postural reactions as well. The moment somebody bumps you, you would automatically right your posture, and that's lifelong. But in that first period in utero, 9 months in utero, in the first 6 months in life, it's the prime time when the primitive reflex system triggers, and it triggers the development and the connection between different senses, different parts to the brain, using specific muscles. Isn't that phenomenal? There's a dance. Nature uses specific movements, very specific movements, to wire very specific senses and connect them to very specific sites in the brain using very specific movements. So in a baby, those infant reflexive movements are vitally important, because it's those movements that creates the base architecture that Dawn speaks so eloquently about, that you would use for the rest of your life. Okay? Yes, you would add to it. Yes, you can also always modify it, but the essence is there before you're 2 years old. And for that reason, we include it in your manual, because Elmer Green from the Mayo Clinic said, if there's any change on a physical level, on an emotional level, or a cognitive level, it would affect the other two. And from a mind dynamics perspective, our focus is and has always been the role of the physical body. That's why it's called neuroscience. The role of the physical body in the thought process. So temperaments, personality, all of those things, that's not what you find at mind dynamics. Here, we look at the architecture of the brain, and it is predominantly stimulated and structured within those first 1,000 days. And just to mention one or two or three of those infant reflexes, the very first one that's observable is 5 weeks after conception. I mean, that's not even a human being with arms and legs yet. It's just like a bean. It's a tiny, tiny little embryo. But the moment anything comes close to it, the umbilical cord, the womb, if anything comes close to it, it instinctively moves away. So the very first primitive reflex is called the withdrawal reflex. So the purpose is to sensitize the skin and the correlating parts in the brain using specific muscles. And you know what? When that reflex has done its job, so a reflex is a simple thing. It's tasked to develop a specific pathway and use it numerous times so it becomes myelinated, it becomes strong, and the moment has been established, then it must go to rest. And it doesn't die off. The reflex does not die off. It stays available for repair purposes later on. Should there be injury to the different parts of the brain or to a sensory motor system, that primitive reflex would re-emerge to repair. Isn't that amazing? So with the withdrawal reflex, when it goes to rest, a baby is left to seek touch and to seek connection. But if it doesn't retire, it stays active into childhood, later into adulthood. You see that very easily in people who don't like to make eye contact, for example, find it very difficult to connect with others, people who tend to be hypersensitive on an emotional level as well, because emotion is always a response to a physical stimulus or to a mental input. So every one of the reflexes can leave a mark on a person. The Moro reflex, which follows onto the withdrawal reflex. So the withdrawal reflex sensitizes the skin. The Moro reflex sensitizes the entire movement system. So it's associated with the Moro reflex. Moro reflex is the startle reflex. So it's not pretty. Eyes fly open, mouth flies open, arms up that. So do the legs. And the purpose of that reflex is to wire the entire central and peripheral nervous system. And when so it is very positive in its intent, plus it's responsible for muscle tone and sensory integration. So when it inhibits in infancy, more or less 5 months after birth, do you know what happens? A person is alert but relaxed. So when necessary, they can go into stress and survival mode. And they acknowledge that stress is a trigger that says, pay attention. Okay, but if the person's Moro reflex did not go to rest, you can read more about this in your manual, but stress is a perpetual companion. It's part of your day every single day. You can't relax and let go. Okay, so nature's amazing. The reflex that follows on after the Moro reflex is the rooting and sucking. What's the purpose of the rooting and sucking reflex? It says, wow, the Moro just created tremendous pathways for anxiety as well, but for alertness and for survival, which is fundamental. But you also need to relax. And what follows on the Moro reflex is the rooting and sucking reflex. The rooting and sucking reflex stimulates the senses of smell and taste, but its primary responsibility is to help you to relax, to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, because the Moro activates the sympathetic nervous system. And we'll talk a bit more about stress a little bit later, but the rooting and sucking, as well as the grasping reflexes of the hands, which is called the palmar and the plantar. It's not in your manual, but it's part of a cluster of reflexes that gives you a sense of safety and security. And safety and security always starts with you, feeling safe and secure in your own skin. And so these reflexes develop the peripheral and the central nervous system. It establishes that baseline architecture that you need for all skills. All skills are based on the fundamental architecture that is established the first 1,000 days. conception to more or less your second birthday. Marvelous.